Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, vice president of FFF. This is the Libertarian Angle. Welcome to our show. Nice to be back with y'all. This is a show that, as you know, brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. We just returned from a really exciting lecture tour. Well, it wasn't really a lecture tour. It was a Libertarian Angle tour where we went to 5 college campuses in the Southeast. We began in Jacksonville, Florida, at the University of North Florida, and then we did this in a car. It was like, an old-fashioned rock tour or something. And we drove from Jacksonville, Florida, over to Atlanta, where we spoke at Georgia Tech. And we went up to Athens, Georgia, and spoke at the University of Georgia. Then up to South Carolina, where we spoke at the University of South Carolina at Columbia. And then we wrapped up everything at Georgia Tech in Raleigh, North Carolina. North Carolina State. Yeah, NC State. Sorry, North Carolina State. And it was just a great time. And we really had a good time and interacting with the students and non-students alike. I mean, it was an interesting mix of students and non-students. Many of the students were well versed in libertarian principles, and others were brand new. They had heard about the event, so they were there and kind of getting exposed to libertarian principles. And then there were some non-students there, so it made for a fascinating dynamic, and the format was just like it is here. Sheldon and I would engage in a conversation about libertarian principles for about 30 minutes and how they apply to the welfare state, the warfare state, interventionism, the drug war, and so forth. And then we would open it up for a discussion for another 30 minutes. And it was just fantastic. It was really a nice formula, and we got a lot of audience participation. A lot of the people stayed after the event, which is always a good sign, discussing and debating and so forth. And so I told Sheldon, I said, hey, let's discuss the tour this morning. And he said, great. So, Sheldon, one of the things that I felt was important that we accomplished in this tour was to raise the vision of people to a higher level, especially students, because, we're all born and raised in the welfare, warfare state way of life. And at each event, we would tell people this, that, you're born and raised in a system and you think, oh, this is freedom because you're taught it's freedom. And what I wanted to accomplish with this tour was to let these students and whoever else attended know that the real libertarian vision is a dismantling of these programs of the welfare state and warfare state. Because, as they read conservative literature, they're likely to think, well, these are permanent fixtures to American life, the welfare state and the warfare state, that we have to now work our way around to how to fix them and reform them and so forth, which is an endless task because the reforms always produce new crises. And I wanted to raise our vision to a higher level in terms of a genuinely free society involves the dismantling of both the warfare state and the welfare state. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think in many cases we had people who were sort of just on the road to learning about liberty and and discovering the huge volume of literature there is on all aspects of liberty in the free society. And I can remember to my earliest days discovering all of this. There's a certain, there could be a certain timidity about telling other people you think it all ought to be abolished. When you're first encountering you don't hear it from other people. So it just sounds a little bit, beyond the pale. So to have you and me out there saying that in a knowledgeable way, discussing it, not just saying it, but actually discussing why that's the proper position, can be a very important step in a student's intellectual development, and kind of can embolden a new student of liberty to realize that indeed is the correct position, and then that they need not be timid or fearful about saying it to people. So I think it was a very valuable service.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about when you mention how people discover libertarianism and how you discovered it, that when, and my experience during these 5 days, and really my experience generally in the libertarian movement with respect to people becoming libertarians, I love to ask them, how did you discover libertarianism? And what's interesting is that most of the people you ask that question to, the answer involves some type of of self-discovery of libertarianism as compared to somebody trying to convert them. They happen to discover a book that all of a sudden opened their eyes, or a pamphlet, or people said, "Hey, I just discovered your work, and that led me into libertarianism." And so I think that has a valuable lesson with respect to methodology. That we've often said this here at FFF, that really what we need to do is just put the ideas out into the marketplace. Publish our journal, publish our essays, and just have the confidence that the market process will work to bring libertarianism to people who are seeking it, that are questioning, that are challenging. And I think that's one of the big valuable lessons that we learned during the course of the week, is that these are people who are actually seeking the truth. They know something's wrong with this country. Some of them have already discovered libertarianism, so it's kind of exciting to see students that were talking about von Mises and Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt, and you could tell the effect that it was having on students that had, brand new to this, that they were wondering, gosh, how do these students know all this? Because, as you know, they were pointing out to us that they don't learn these things in class. It's all self-education. And so I found that kind of an interesting phenomenon.
No, I think it was very good for the newer ones, or the ones who were maybe not hardly familiar at all, just came out of curiosity, or a friend asked them, to hear the other people in the audience making knowledgeable comments, people who were already very far along and did understand more about it. So the combination of them hearing us converse, and then hearing fellow attendees joining in, I think, I think that in itself was an important step in their own education. I mean, there's this tendency for a lot of people to think that if you get to adulthood or young adulthood and you haven't heard something before, and then you suddenly hear it, your first reaction might be, well, that can't be true. I never heard that before, because my parents didn't tell me, my teachers didn't tell me, I never see this discussed in the media, and so there's this sort of inertia that if this were true, surely more people would believe it, and I would have come in contact with it sooner than this. So we have to overcome that, because it's perfectly possible for something to be true, and yet you could reach 20 years old and never have heard it discussed. Now, we live in a better time than previously, in the sense that I think the chances of encountering libertarian ideas are greater than they were when we were that age, and maybe even in earlier times. There are more professors in colleges and universities who are libertarians and know the libertarian literature, and so more students are encountering it in class than used to be the case, and just from other places. It's actually discussed on TV now and then, and when it comes to political races. So I think we did an important thing, and hopefully we reinforced things they're hearing from other places about what is this thing called libertarianism.
Yeah, I was intrigued when one of the participants was a high school teacher that told us that he was a libertarian, and that he was introducing our materials and libertarian ideas to his classes, in terms of the welfare state as well as the national security state. And I asked him, I said, do you catch any flack for this? And he says, no, that so far so good. But that he's over there teaching just pure libertarianism to these high school students, which I just found fascinating and very, very positive. Let's discuss one of the main issues that we brought up there during these programs, and that was this reform mindset that exists within conservatives and liberals. And of course, conservatives believe in socialism. They believe in the welfare state. They don't make any bones about it. And I use liberals in the progressive sense of the term. But conservatives are a little bit different, because they profess to love the free market, love free enterprise, but then they endorse a lot of these socialist programs, or really all the socialist programs as well. Maybe public donation to the arts being the one exception. But one of the things we kept bringing up was health care. And, I thought we'd start out with, your analysis of Obamacare, why you think it's going to be headed toward a train wreck. And then, we can talk about the larger picture of health care that we would bring up with these students to show them, what the real free market approach is. So why don't you take it from there and talk about Obamacare and health care?
Well, that was on people's minds. Of course, it's been in the news the last several weeks with the unveiling of the website for these insurance exchanges, and so it's on people's minds. So it does make sense to talk about what people are thinking about, wondering about. They may have questions about what exactly is wrong with Obamacare. I mean, a lot of people may think there's something wrong with it, but I'd like to hear some more detailed analysis about the problem. The way I try to put it to people is, first of all, Obamacare is not something brand new or super radical. It simply builds on a bad system. It builds and intensifies a system that was already bad. And when I say that, I mean that it the system has been built on the idea of third-party payment. In other words, patients, consumers of healthcare services shouldn't face the costs or the true costs or the true prices of those services. That's been the case at least since World War II, when the tax laws were made employer provided insurance attractive because again of the tax laws, and then that might have been a wartime contingency because of wage and price controls, but they stuck with it after the war, so it's now lived on, and most people get their insurance through an employer, and then when you add, and now Obamacare is mandating that employers provide insurance, although they delayed that for a year. And then of course they have the individual mandate where everyone has to, if they don't get it from their employer, they have to then go out and buy it, although they face this at this point relatively small penalty. So the idea is to push everybody into third-party payment and then add on top of that Medicaid and Medicare, which of course is where the government is the third party. So it's something like 85 cents on the dollar is paid for by somebody else, which means you've taken the cost-conscious consumer out of the picture. And anybody who understands how markets work realize that that's not a way to get rational outcomes. If consumers are basically facing artificially cheap goods and services because third parties are paying one way or another, or they themselves may be paying, but it's in subtle ways that's not connected at the point of sale, you're going to get huge distortions, and that's what we have. That's only part of it. Obviously, there's licensing and there's certification of hospitals by government. The medical societies are in partnership with the government in the various states. The various states are regulatory cartels for the insurance industry. I mean, it's thoroughly corrupted and thoroughly distorted by a variety of government interventions. So that's the way we need to talk about it. Conservatives, they don't like Obamacare, but they pretend that before Obamacare passed, we had, quote, the greatest healthcare system in the world, and then neglect these other things. And when they controlled the Congress, they didn't do anything to peel away regulations. A lot of them are at the state level, but there's things at the national level that a Congress could begin to repeal. They didn't talk about any of that until Obamacare came along. And in fact, in 1993, the Heritage Foundation, which is the premier conservative think tank in Washington, was promoting an individual insurance mandate as a response to, as an alternative to what was called Hillary Care back then, Clinton Care, which was a very complicated proposal to take over the healthcare system, and it didn't go anywhere. But it was interesting that the conservatives, as an alternative, were proposing that every individual be forced to buy health insurance. So the conservatives do not have a good record in this matter at all.
Well, one of the amusing things about the trip is that you were at one of the lunches we were having or something. You were pointing out to me about the mental health aspects of Obamacare, where all these young people were going to now be entitled to free healthcare services. I put free in quotation marks for the government's now going to start funding this thing. And you were telling me what a train wreck you thought this was going to be headed toward. And why don't you share with the audience what happened then?
Well, I mentioned this a week ago on Friday in my TGIF. There's a paragraph about this, so I was aware of this. First of all, the mental health lobby, which is a pretty strong, active lobby of people who sell services, and obviously therefore want the government to help people buy their services because they will benefit from that. They have been pushing for what they've called parity in medical insurance, which means that any insurance company it would have to cover so-called mental health services to the same extent that they cover medical health services. And that was a separate bill that was passed a few years ago. Now that's been incorporated into Obamacare. The Health and Human Services Department issued its regulations. That's why these stories in the newspaper popped up last week. And so it's a very interesting point here. One of the premises of Obamacare is, in order to cover people, in order to get medical coverage to people who today don't have it, particularly people who are already sick and therefore can't qualify for health insurance, the way to get them covered is to force young people to buy insurance, force them into the pool, so to speak. So on the premise that young people tend to be healthy, obviously there are exceptions, but on average tend to be healthy, and therefore will be paying premiums, but drawing out very little. In other words, they'll be net contributors, and that then can be, that money that they're paying in will then be used to pay for the coverage of already sick people and older people who, people who would be net drawers of benefits rather than net contributors. So that's the idea. That's the very premise. But USA Today had an interesting article drawing on various people who know this stuff, pointing out that the premise may be wrong, because a lot of young people do go for mental health services in the form of being depressed, anxiety, eating disorders, and once they see that the price is artificially low because it's now in their insurance and they're not paying the full cost of it, people who might have not wanted to spend their own money on those services will now say, now I'll do it. It's not going to be free, but of course it's going to be artificially low priced, and that will cause some people to consume those services when they wouldn't have otherwise. So that upsets the premise. Instead of them being pretty much net contributors, they will be drawing out much more than was anticipated. And that then puts the whole thing on really shaky grounds. Now, the thing about mental health services, and here I draw on the work of the great Thomas Szasz, who wrote so much about this, late great Thomas Szasz, who wrote so much about this in over 50 years of writing about this, someone who was psychiatrically trained and knew what he was talking about. These kind of complaints that we call mental health, and now I see the papers using the papers, and I take it this means Health and Human Services is using this term, behavioral health services. It's funny, now they're not even saying mental health, they're saying behavioral health. These are not objective ailments the way medical sicknesses are. We can tell if someone has pneumonia or cancer or dementia, but there's no test for if somebody has anxiety or is having trouble sleeping or is feeling depressed. And so when people go to the doctor and say, I'm feeling anxiety, can you prescribe something? Or when it goes for, say, therapy, talk therapy with a psychiatrist or a psychologist, there's no objective test for that. And so if you force the price down relatively low, many people are going to consume that because they don't have to pay the full price. And that, if there were no other objection to Obamacare, that shows you how shaky the whole thing is. And there's a huge explosion of costs that's on the horizon that's going to upset the whole thing. Now, maybe it'll make the whole thing fall apart, and therefore that would be good.
Well, and then while we were on the trip, I think it was USA Today published an article saying the exact same thing. So I had to listen to you. And then the next day,
the New York Times. Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I mean, this is the point that we were making, that it's not just enough to call for the repeal of Obamacare, which is what all these conservatives are doing, because you end up with the healthcare crisis that gave rise to Obamacare. And what is that crisis rooted in? It's rooted in Medicare and Medicaid. And conservatives used to say this back in the 60s, before they threw in the towel and finally accepted it. That's on the demand side. You've got the occupational licensure, which is really just a protection racket for doctors, along with all the other professions that are licensed, lawyers, hair salons, shoe shine people, and so forth. And then, as you point out, you have this income tax distortion where people buy their insurance through their employer, and then that locks them into the workplace, because if they leave, they lose their insurance. They have to apply for new insurance. And so you got all these distortions that come about because of government intervention, because of these socialistic type programs. So the real solution to this is a free market, a genuine free market, not what conservatives call for with their little medical IRAs and the plan that you mentioned. It entails pulling the weed out by its root. Repealing Medicare, repealing Medicaid, repealing occupational licensure, repealing the whole income tax, but at least that particular warped distortion in which employers are encouraged to buy health insurance for their employees. That's the only solution there is. And I think that's what one of the main benefits of this trip was, because my hunch is that a lot of these students had just never even considered that, because as you and I kept pointing out, when you're born and raised in a system that you're taught as freedom, it never occurs to you that, hey, we can have a society without Medicare and Medicaid and licensure and Obamacare and all this other government interventionism. And I think that's one of the real benefits of raising their vision to a higher level, of getting rid of this junk rather than reforming it.
I agree. I mean, I think on the part of a lot of conservatives, there's just a sort of a resignation. I've known conservatives who, if they could just wave a wand, might be very happy to get rid of all that intervention in the medical area. But I think that they have this sense of, quote, realism that says, look, we're not going to get rid of that, so let's just do the best we can. Let's introduce certain market incentives, so it'll be cheaper or better for the recipients. So I think there's a good faith there. I don't think it's that they favor the welfare state. It's not their first choice, but they feel they're in the position where they have to cast around for what's second best. And I think that's why we do perform a valuable service in talking about why the first choice is not only preferable by definition. The first is preferable to the second, but also feasible and possible. And so I think we're doing. I know I'm patting myself on the back here, but I think we're doing important work by making that clear.
Yeah, my beef with conservatives is that they sell this as freedom. They teach their children that their little reforms are free enterprise, that this is free market reforms. When they may be improving life, under serfdom. And that's certainly important, but they shouldn't be teaching people that that's what freedom is all about. Freedom is what you and I are preaching. And one of the main things that we would emphasize in each of these programs was the moral principles. Of course, we recognized the utilitarian concepts, the benefits that come with a free market, increased prosperity, increased charity. But really our major focus was on the moral principles, that it's wrong for the government to take money from one person and give it to another person, that it's wrong for the government to interfere with freedom of choice, that people should be free to decide what to do with their own money, whether it's to donate it, invest it, hire an immigrant with it, because it's their money. And I think that it's that moral case that sometimes the students don't hear, because so much of the focus is on the benefits of free markets. And so I think that's another thing that was important for us to emphasize. And you brought up an example during the course of the week where you compared the private thief to government and challenged students with respect to this difference in morality. Would you remind us about that?
Yeah, I tried to show that I don't think the differences between us and just the average person are as great as sometimes they're made out to be, and that might make our job easier if we realize it's not so different. It's just that we have a single moral standard that we apply to all people, whether they're officers of government or not, but other people don't. They're brought up believing that government officials can do things that the rest of us are not allowed to do, which is say go to door basically and demand money from our neighbors so that we can feed the homeless. If you and I try to do that, or any of our listeners try to do that just on their own, they'll be properly recognized as engaging in armed robbery or threats or extortion. But when a government official does it, then for some reason the rules are different. So we have to show people that the rules are not different. Or alternatively, they may think, well, if we all voted for it, so that the officer of government now can do it. They think that's different. And I kept invoking Bastiat that no group can have, a group can't have rights that the members of the group don't already have. So there's only individual rights. And so that was what I tried to push. On this, I don't even think there's this big distinction between what's moral and what's practical, because a policy or a program or a regime that systematically causes misery, social misery for people, is an immoral policy. That I don't like to just dismiss that as a practical consideration. That's immoral, causing mass social misery. So if a policy does that, that's an immoral policy. I think morality and practicality go together. I think the Greeks used to say the moral is the practical. So I don't even like to give an inch on that.
Well, yeah, and as I pointed out, I grew up in what the Census Bureau called the poorest city in the United States, Laredo, Texas, and we didn't have Medicare and Medicaid and a lot of these other interventions, and it was the greatest healthcare system in the world. Doctors loved what they did. And doctors, they treated a lot of poor people in Laredo. The doctors' offices were filled, and doctors never turned away one single patient, even though they knew that most of them wouldn't be able to pay. And nonetheless, they were still very prosperous. They were the second wealthiest people in Laredo, second only to the oilmen, because they made their money off the middle class and the wealthy, and they would subsidize this with free health care for the poor that couldn't pay. And that's really what genuine charity is all about. It's not about force. And so one of the things we emphasize is that in a free society, the poor actually benefit the most. And you were bringing up examples like voluntary lodges where people would get health insurance through the lodge, poor people, and that in a free dynamic system, you got a lot of prosperity where the poor are benefiting by becoming wealthy instead of dependent on government assistance. So really, it's the genuine free market, the dismantling of these programs that does the most good for people, especially at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Well, there wouldn't be so many poor people. Even in the days you're talking about, late 50s, 60s, there was the minimum wage that came in during the New Deal. There was occupational licensing. There might have been less then than there is today, but still there was occupational licensing. There was a long list of things that I like to refer to as government toll gates on the road to personal prosperity. So those people that you remember seeing getting treated for free by doctors, they wouldn't have been poor in a freed society. So there'd be the need for charity would be much less. Mutual aid was not charity. Mutual aid was working people, not high income people, but working people who joined a club basically, primarily maybe initially for social purposes, camaraderie and whatnot. But then all these other services were added on as a way to gain members because they were competitive. You could join one club or you could join another club, and they started offering benefits, and you paid your dues. And then if you got sick and couldn't work, you drew out the money to tide you over. Or if the breadwinner died, the family got a benefit to tide them over, et cetera, burial benefits. And one of them was, like you said, the lodge practice where they would contract with a doctor on an annual basis. The doctor had some guaranteed income, each month through the year, and in return, provided general practitioner services to the members of the lodge and their families. And they figured out how low middle income people can get medical care. Today, all the policymakers are puzzling over how to do this, and they have these huge interventions in order to accomplish what people left to their own devices were accomplishing. Unfortunately, it was put down by organized medicine because they didn't like the competition.
Yeah, and well, we spent most of the time today on the domestic issues. We also addressed, of course, the drug war, which is one of the biggest violations of individual liberty, not to mention the horrific utilitarian consequences of the drug war. And then we also reserved every time about 10 minutes to talk about the warfare state, the national security state, the power of the government to assassinate us and to torture us and to take us into military custody. I mean, this is a revolutionary development in American constitutional law, and it's all been accomplished without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. And we point out to the students that this is an aberrant way of life. It doesn't have to be here as a permanent fixture. It was brought into existence to fight the so-called Cold War. Cold War is over. We told the students about the things that the U.S. government did to go ahead and produce the anger and the hatred, its policies in the Middle East that generate themselves into the threat of terrorist counterstrikes. And then they use the counterstrikes to take away our freedoms over here in the name of keeping us safe. And not to mention all of the collateral aspects of this, the out-of-control spending, the debt, the inflation around the corner. So it was important that we expose students to that aspect of it as well.
True. As the great Chalmers Johnson, the late Chalmers Johnson put it, you either get rid of the empire or you live under it. And that was your point, how it gets extended to domestic policy, because they have, they've provoked all this animosity against Americans and the U.S. government, and then the government uses that as a way to keep us agitated, keep us afraid, keep us willing to put up with government intrusions that we wouldn't put up with if we didn't perceive those threats. And so it's a self-perpetuating mechanism. That's why I once quipped that George W. Bush should have won the Nobel Prize for Physics, because he managed to create the perpetual motion machine, because everything the government does just creates the rationale for the next thing it does, and so it never ends. However, we're trying to find a way to end it.
Yeah, it's just a big racket. I mean, it's like Smedley Butler's the ex, I think he was an admiral. No, he was a Marine general, I think.
Marine general.
Yeah, he wrote that great little book, War is a Racket, and talking about all the interventions he had done on behalf of the U.S. military were done to assist U.S. corporations, especially in Latin America. The whole thing's a racket. The whole warfare state's a racket. The domestic situation with welfarism and corporatism and bailout of Wall Street and bailout of their corporate buddies, it's all a racket. And I think that's one of the important things that we were conveying to the students, that it is a racket, and that there is an alternative. And that alternative is the free society and a free market system. So we're out of time. Sheldon, enjoyed the conversation as usual. This is the Libertarian Angle. Come and visit us at fff.org. Thank you very much for your great support. It enables us to do programs like this with Libertarian Angle on the road. And much thanks to each of those individual chapters at the Young Americans for Liberty for all the work you did in organizing this thing and hosting it. We know you got classes and exams and term papers, and everything just went flawlessly. And the venue was fantastic. The discussion, one of the cool things is everybody at each venue would hang out afterwards, sometimes like as much as 30 minutes or longer, discussing and debating what we had discussed during the previous hour. So it was a great time. Thank you very much to those chapters, and thank you very much to our supporters for your great support. And we'll see you next time.